Yes, it is very so different healthcare. 2 days before that, your theory was against people calling theory from the no. And something mysteriously that changed his vote to a yes. And I'm wondering, in the same situation with all that arm twisting and bribery or whatever happened, how would you handle that from the administration? Because the pressure was so tough it would change your vote from a no, everybody wants, to a yes, what's your pressure to do?
Well, you can't twist the arm of a guy that doesn't need the job, and that's the thing. Mr. Boccieri needs that job. He wants that job, and that's one of the problems. I've said all along, we need to send people to Washington who not only have the life experiences that I have, but also to say, I don't need the job, and I'm going to do what's right for this district, even if I don't get reelected. John Boccieri has to worry about being reelected. I don't have to worry about reelected. I'm going to do what's right for you, no matter what. And if I lose the job by doing what's right for you, then that means I still have lived with my values and my principles of serving you. That's the difference between myself and John Boccieri.
It's kind of along those same lines, but one of the biggest problems that I see with a lot of these bills is that they're so big, they have so many things stuck on the side of them. How do you really decide, the good, there's good parts, there's bad parts. How do you sort it out to, separate the good from the bad?
Well, again, my answer to that would be, in my business world, if somebody gave me a 2,000-page contract, I'm not signing it. All right? And I'm a firm believer that if you take that logic to Washington, you would say, wait a minute, there is no way in the world I know what's in those 2,000 pages. So it doesn't seem like just simple logic that we need to get these bills down to a reasonable level, and I think that's what we need to start looking at. Now, otherwise, you're never going to get me to approve it. And I got to tell you, in my career, 28 years in business, have I signed a few contracts that I wish I never did? Probably. But I learned one thing at the latter part of my career. That's where the business background comes in. I would never sign a contract that I didn't know everything that was in it. I didn't know the good and the bad. And if there were bad things in there that affected this district, I'm not voting for it. So we do need to try and get bills limited down. I think what happens is the bill starts to make its way to passage and people start throwing things in it. And it's one of the problems with earmarks. Earmarks get thrown in there while that bill's making its way to a final vote. And a lot of times people don't know what's in there. So I'm going to go back to my main background, my basic background. I'm not signing a 2,000-page bill if I don't know what's in there, and if I can't make sure that everything in there is okay for the district I represent.
What are some areas of healthcare that you think need fixed? Obviously, there's a lot going on right now, but what are some examples that you would point out that in healthcare that needs addressed?
Well, I always tell everybody after 28 years of healthcare, primarily in the nursing home business, but also overseeing physician offices and also overseeing hospitals, I can tell you that we practice defensive medicine in this country. We do things to make sure we avoid that lawsuit. I did things in the nursing home business to make sure we avoided that lawsuit. I always tell the best example in the nursing home business, if a patient fell down, we sent him to the emergency room. The highest expenditure in healthcare is in the emergency room. Why did we do that? Because if we tried to make sure that the resident was taken care of properly in the nursing home and you make one mistake, you end up getting sued. A doctor's office, if you don't run all the proper tests, you end up getting sued. It's a problem. And I believe that one of the greatest places that there's two ways of bringing costs down. Number one is competition. So in healthcare, if you think about it, the small business owner today, he has very few options to bid out health insurance. I have a small business. Every time I bid out my health insurance, I'm lucky to get 2 bids. Why is that? Well, because we're in a state of Ohio where we only have the opportunity for 2. There are 1,600 providers in this country. Why don't I have the right to buy health insurance from Arizona, California, wherever it is, that takes care of my employees, which I want to do anyway, but at the least amount of cost. I should have that right. That will bring costs down in healthcare. The second thing is tort reform. The minute we can get tort reform to a point where we don't have to practice defensive medicine, costs will come down. And those are the two things I think we need to look very closely at as far as bringing our healthcare costs down. But competition is the number one place to always bring healthcare down. Any cost.
Jim, you talked about tax cuts or lowering the tax burden on Americans. Often, I think people like Pelosi and some of the party in power right now talk about tax cuts as something that costs them. They see it on the ledger that it costs the government to do tax cuts. However, we've seen with JFK and Ronald Reagan that taxes were cut and the income to the federal government swelled because of the economic activity. What is your position on tax cuts? If you think that's would ignite our economy, or is it something that's just a cost and a burden to government?
Well, actually, I would say this. I think tax cuts, if you think about it, if I have a small business and you cut my taxes 20%, and I can employ more people with that 20%. All right. Is this on? Can you hear me now? If I have, if I get a tax cut, 5%, 10%, whatever the number is, and I have that ability now to reinvest in my business and my employees, and now they can earn a living and pay taxes on that money, and they can go out and consume more products, and it's a generator of economic opportunity. And definitely, I believe tax cuts are essential to get that machine rolling. But I'll tell you what else tax cuts do. If you think about it, the government today is spending your tax money. And until you reduce taxes, how do you ever get them to reduce expenditures? One comes right beside the other one. Less taxes mean less expenses. We've got to bring our taxes down. At the same time, generate that economic machine, but force the government to bring their expenses down. Any other questions?
Jim, you talked about cap and trade. How would you take cap and trade away? Because the administration right now through the EPA, U.S. EPA, is still making rule changes and implementing some of that stuff. How would you head that off to pass, per se?
The cap and trade bill?
Well, no. If cap and trade doesn't pass, the EPA is still making rule changes and things like that that are affecting us as business people and costing us a lot more money. And it's going to affect all of us eventually.
Right. My answer to that is when you put strong elected officials into office with the background and experience I have, and then they can go down there and say, this has to stop. Look, worst case, I used to always say this to the city of Wadsworth, if we have an issue, we defund it. That's how you fix it. You defund it. And that's the one thing you can do in Congress. When it comes to that power, the bureaucrats have, they have it more and more whenever you have the inability to keep strong elected officials in office. I mean, it's one of the problems I would say with our state system. We have today, we basically have term limits, and I would be the one to admit that I voted for term limits many years ago, but I think it was a bad thing, because when you have good representation like you have with Ron Amstutz, he should be able to stay in that position as long as you allow him to stay in that position. But if you keep rotating people, who are the strongest people in the state of Ohio or in the federal government? It's the bureaucrats. So you have to let the elected officials take care of the issues. And of course, in my world, you defund it and you eliminate it and you take the power away from them.